Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Madison Mills, a journalist at Bloomberg Quick Take. The killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Nina Pop, Tony McDade, and countless others have led to national conversations about racial injustice. Today, I'm joined by Matt McGorry, an actor, activist, and co-founder of WeInspireJustice, to talk about what effective allyship looks like now and moving forward. For those watching, please comment with any questions you have for Matt, and I will ask him as many as we can get to while we're chatting. Matt, thank you so much for making time to meet with us today.
Thank you, Madison. I appreciate you having me here for this important conversation.
Of course. So Matt, I just want to start with the absolute basics here. What is allyship?
Yeah. I think we really need to think of allyship not as an identity, really, but actually as a practice, right? I think a lot of times we hear folks sort of self-identify as allies, and I actually think there's a mistake in that because ultimately, as white folks, it's not on ourselves to proclaim ourselves as allies. It's the folks that we are in solidarity with that are most directly impacted, in this case, Black folks, who determine that label for us. But it's a practice. It's an everyday practice of dismantling systems of oppression that give us privilege, that oppress other people. So at the most fundamental level, that is really what it is. And that means that some days we get it right and some days we don't. And sometimes if we just give ourselves the blanket label of being allies, it lets us off the hook because we think that we're using at times like past actions to justify why we might be right in this moment. And the truth is that, it's a constant lifelong learning process that we just have to be engaged in because it is important and valuable.
And I'm curious how you would compare or contrast allyship with anti-racism then.
Yeah. I think they are similar, right? Allyship also can apply across many different identities. So recognizing that I have privilege in many different areas. I am a man. I am a cisgender man. I'm a heterosexual man. So I'm also a man with class privilege. So to understand that, allyship across all spectrums and a full really definition of allyship means really looking at the different layers of the privilege that I have, right? It's not, it's not enough to abstractly be working in the practice of allyship in one area, right? Because we recognize that even with Black folks, there are multiple layers of oppression that people experience, right? Black trans women face the effects of transphobia, misogyny, and anti-Black racism all together. And we actually have to be looking at, as a cisgender man, for example, how do I be an ally to trans folks? As a heterosexual man, how to be an ally to LGBTQ folks? And to constantly be looking really at those that are most marginalized and making those people our priority in terms of our solidarity. Because if we don't do that, if we have a general sort of idea of anti-racism that doesn't include all these other systems of oppression, then ultimately we will be lifting some up and leaving the most marginalized behind.
And I think one thing folks watching will certainly notice is that we are two white folks having this conversation. What's something that you've done to sort of decenter yourself in this work and ensure that you're uplifting the work of Black activists who've been at this work for a long time?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? We talk a lot about decentering whiteness in anti-racism work, and that is important. It's important because as white folks and just as society in general, unconsciously we are centering whiteness all the time without even realizing it, right? If, we are looking at I think about, for example, my first improv class that I was ever in that was all white people. And none of us, as far as I knew, ever really thought of that. And so it was centering whiteness unconsciously, right? And that is a result of the systems, that is a result of none of us knowing because of our own internalized racism and white supremacy and which is white centering. So it's important in anti-racist work to be amplifying folks of color, Black, Indigenous, and folks of color, because ultimately they are the experts in their own lived experiences, right? It is, most of what I've learned about allyship has come from, leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? So it's important to be lifting up the voices that are silenced, and truthfully they are, right? And so, part of the sort of the contradiction of white anti-racism involves understanding that the times as white people, we need to speak directly to other white people, right? So that is centering whiteness, actually. But the truth is that, unfortunately, and I'll speak to this, in my own experience as a white person who only came into started to begin to come into consciousness 5-6 years ago, was that we're really oftentimes, as white folks, when we hear about racism, we think of it as like a problem for folks of color to deal with. And the truth is actually that it is primarily a white person's problem. It is the system that white people benefit the most from. It's a system that is mostly maintained and supported by white people. And so we actually have to be willing to name whiteness too, in a way, the way that we are now. And as white people, we have to be willing to speak to white folks specifically to say what our role is, because racism, and as we call it in the activist community, white supremacy, is not some abstract nebulous concept, right? White people are not raceless. We are not neutral. We are not the sort of the default setting, which is how most white people are raised to think, right? That is a part of white supremacy. So in order to do that, we actually have to be able to name whiteness too. And in doing that, work to find that balance of being able to amplify people of color and the voices of those that are most directly impacted.
And you mentioned the importance of speaking with other white folks about race. I'm wondering if you have advice for folks who are having these conversations, particularly with family members for the first time. I've spoken with a lot of young people who are struggling in these conversations with their parents, for example. What's your advice on navigating that?
Yeah, it's complicated, but it is a process. It's a skill that you build too, right? Like part of the way whiteness and white supremacy operates is that it teaches us that basically it's better to be polite than it is to actually stand for justice, right? And that is actually, obviously that disproportionately affects people of color by continuing to have these systems be in place. It also affects us as white people because it really destroys and erodes our integrity. So again, I think rooting in the idea that, yes, this is about solidarity with folks of color and dismantling systems of oppression, and also understanding our own humanity is at stake when we are silently complicit as people are being racist around us. I think some of the most important things for me in that regard are to remember really what are the things that open you up in conversation, right? If someone was going to be telling you they disagreed with something you said or that you were wrong about something, what are the things that open you up to that, right? And it's actually the same with other people. And I think a lot of times as white folks, particularly who are newly coming into understanding about anti-racism, there's understandably at times a lot of guilt for understanding the past ways that we have caused harm. And I think at times we then project that on other white folks, and we want to distance ourselves from that so badly because it can be very painful. And in order to do that, or as a part of that, we end up then shaming other white people. And the truth is actually, it's ultimately the goal is to get other white people to come closer to the movement, not to push folks further away from the movement. So I think some of those important parts are asking questions, right? Not assuming that we know why someone is saying something. To ask a question is to really get to the root of the understanding of it. And yes, we may understand that an idea is rooted in racism, but we have to understand how this idea exactly correlates with this person's individual beliefs. We can't do that if we're not asking questions. So in the movement, we tend to think of this as something called calling in, right? And showing up for racial justice, which is one of my political homes of the largest grassroots organization of white folks working against white supremacy. We talk about this concept a lot, right? It's about calling people into the movement. It's not about shaming people and throwing them away. But for folks who are open to learning, it really is about bringing them closer. And we have to also understand that, like, I'm going to mess up, right? I've been doing this work very hard for a number of years. Like, I am not perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect, activist, white anti-racist. So I know that at times I will need grace. And so I have to be able to extend that to other people, because ultimately it's about winning. It's not about feeling good about, being the best activist. It's about actually being effective at bringing people into the movement.
And I'm so curious about how to navigate that moment when you do make a mistake. Like you mentioned, everyone is going to make a mistake. What course of action do you take yourself when that happens?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, it's important not to be defensive. Again, I've been a Sorry, is this for if I've messed up or if someone else has said something?
I'm curious. I think our audience would love to know how you handle that, and then they can apply that to how they would navigate that situation themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. I think to recognize first and foremost that being defensive is not helpful, right? And particularly, look, I think there's a different response and responsibility that comes depending on who you're having this conversation with, right? It is not the responsibility of Black people to educate white people about racism, right? And that is a constant burden for most Black folks, right? To be able to just exist in the world where constant oppression is existing and microaggressions are existing. In order to just navigate that world, we know that is an incredibly difficult, traumatizing task. So first and foremost, I'll say that we should never expect that the person who is telling us about our racism, if they are a person of color, and especially a Black person, should go through the emotional labor of bringing us through that. If it's another white person, again, I do think that we have a responsibility as white people to not necessarily just call out the thing, but then also to say, like, I understand where this is coming from, and I would like to share with you some resources for how I moved my own understanding to be different, right? To go that extra step, because that's really important, because it's not about just stopping the thing. It's about how do we fundamentally re-educate and create a different way of being white in this world. But recognizing that the first response is usually defensiveness, right? Our bodies can tighten up and tense up, and to recognize that we don't want to project that on someone else, right? So it might take a moment. We might have to sit with it, to notice what's happening in our body, and also really to thank the person for taking the time to point it out, because that's a really hard thing to do, and to be able to thank the person, and then basically not make it about only our intentions, right? As often as white people, we tend to think of racism as people being intentionally, actively racist. And it's very few people actually who think that they're being racist when they are being racist. So the truth is, we have to understand that in social justice work, as we say a lot, it's impact is more important than intention, right? So just because I had a good intention, that doesn't let me off the hook if I did something that was racist. If I interrupted a person of color when they were talking about their experience, or if I was dismissing a person of color when they talk about their experience, and someone were to tell me that, it doesn't matter that was not my intention. I actually have to own up for the impact of my action, and to understand that, the way whiteness works, the way white supremacy works, it is a constant unlearning. And that is something that will be a part of my life forever, and a practice to unlearn forever.
And Matt, you've been at this work for, I think you mentioned 6 years. How did you originally get involved in this movement?
Yeah. So my original sort of involvement was, reading a book about gender inequity in the workplace. And it was really the first time that I'd ever read a book by a woman about anything remotely like that. And the truth is, right, like, most books that white men read are by other white men, right? Like, the publishing world is mostly white. I mean, this is how whiteness continues to perpetuate itself. So, and those lenses are the lenses that are choosing the books that get published, and the agents who are choosing the authors who get represented. And so it was the first time that I actually, it was so easy to live my life and never have to really be truly directly confronted with an experience that was not my own. And so when I did for the first time, I really thought to myself, wow, I mean, I like to think that, like, fairness is like a core value of mine. And I'm reading that basically there's no way that could possibly be true, because I simply have no idea what other folks experience, right? And it began there. And then I started to begin to notice my own internalized bias, in terms of sexism. And then to start to think, okay, well, I need to challenge this. And then to be able to start challenging that conversation, those dynamics with other people in my life, and particularly with men, right? Like, the same way with anti-racism, some of the most important work we can do as white anti-racists is in the white community. It's when there are no folks of color around that might feel even more uncomfortable to us, because we don't get accolades for doing the right thing. But we have to be able to have those conversations with other white folks. And so basically it started in learning about sexism. And then I started to learn about the concept of intersectionality, as coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. and really understanding that basically women is not like a universal label, right? The universal experience as women is not the same. A rich white woman is going to have a very different experience than a poor Black woman. And if we're not constantly looking at how these multiple systems of oppression impact the most marginalized, we are consistently going to lift up the most privileged, which is going to maintain the inequity. So it started there, and then it continued to branch out as I learned about all the different systems of oppression.
And I'm curious about how men can be invited into these conversations as well. You mentioned intersectionality and the importance of that, but I'm wondering how white men specifically can be invited into anti-racist work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so often what we see across the movement is it's mostly, even in white anti-racist spaces, it's mostly women doing that work, right? And it's really important that as white men that we be involved in that, because again, we are the primary beneficiaries of these systems of white supremacy and sexism. So, at the end of the day, I think it's really important for especially other white men to call in other white men, right? To really be challenging each other to do better, right? To actually to take this on as our own responsibility, to see what our own personal stake is in ending these systems of oppression. I think too often, we are socialized in sort of the white savior narrative, right? And even in Hollywood, my industry is a big propagator of that, right? We think of this idea of like the lone individual who like comes in and kicks butt and the problem is done. And the truth is that like the way that these systems work are just so complex. It is a multi-generational struggle. And I'll say that even as myself, when I began coming into this work, I started to feel I was so daunted by the fact that these systems were so huge, right? And also I was placing it so much on myself too, because again, this sort of individualism, white savior narrative teaches us that we actually, that we have to be the one. And the truth is actually that we need community, right? This work cannot be done in isolation. This is why I always talk about showing up for racial justice, and there's chapters all over the country. But there's a lot of unlearning, and as white folks, oftentimes, particularly as white men, we are so isolated because we're not used to asking for help. And we actually have to understand that we need to be able to learn from other people and to get support from other folks, because this work is hard, it is lifelong, and it lasts for hundreds of years. So in order to really be able to gird ourselves for that journey, for that struggle, we need to be in community with other people.
And you're actively working at this right now with your organization, Inspire Justice. Can you tell our audience about that?
Yeah. So Inspire Justice, basically, we work with artists to leverage their platforms, their hearts, and their creativity towards social change. So when I was, coming up, starting out as an activist, there wasn't anything quite like this. And working with my partner, J. Love Calderon, she became my advisor at the time too, to understand that to exist in my industry and to have the values that I have and to be in integrity is actually very hard, because although Hollywood at times might have a progressive image, actually it is an incredibly toxic industry, right? 90% of shows are created by white men. That is a problem. That is extremely white and extremely male, and that needs to change. And so essentially, we bring the grassroots activists and celebrities, folks with platforms together, right? Because we understand that the answers for the movement, for justice, for anti-racism, come from those with the most direct experience and knowledge about it. And that is a missing gap often, because, again, the way that these systems play into each other is that as celebrities, even when I started, I thought, oh, the biggest nonprofit, with the biggest budget, with the best marketing materials must be the right answer. And we're so not used to looking to working class and poor folks for the answers to the problems of our country. And those are the folks who know best, because they're the people who have to have the lived experience, right? So being able to bridge that gap, making sure that those folks get paid for their work, which is huge, because oftentimes in the nonprofit world, people are, working for very little, burning out. And we want to make sure that folks get paid, that they're sustainable, that we have a profit sharing model, and that we make sure that it is equitable for everyone. And Yeah, and at the core of the work really is the personal transformation towards collective liberation, understanding that this work changes you. It necessitates changing us in order to do the work that we need to do, right? The personal growth that we need to do to be able to have difficult conversations, to be able to release the scarcity around like wanting to grab onto our money and actually move our resources in a meaningful way. This is personal work that is political, but it has to be done in an explicit way in order for us to actually step into power as the activists that the movement needs us to be.
And Matt, you've mentioned several times some of the challenges you faced when you were first getting involved in this work and the unlearning process you went through. What's some very basic, because we don't have enough time, advice you have for people who are just getting started in this work and how to kind of unlearn originally some of these systemic problems?
Yeah, right. Well, I think one thing, and again, I keep stressing this, and again, this is because it's probably one of the most important things, is to be in community, right? Like if you're a white person, look up for showing up for racial justice, go to chapter meetings, right? I think so often as white people, it's like we imagine that like we're entering a whole new world that almost has never existed. And the truth is that this world has existed for a long time. We just don't have examples of it, right? We don't even know about John Brown, Ann Braden, the history of white anti-racists who have been doing this work. So we don't have any examples of white people, of ways to show up as white folks to do this work. And we also need to really be educating ourselves with the work of folks of color, right? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of books by Black anti-racists about how to be an anti-racist. It's just that it's not in the part of the bookstore that most white people tend to look in. So we have to understand that has to be a priority, right? It's not a one-time thing. We don't read one book and we're done. Make a commitment to yourself. Make a commitment to say, you know what, I'm going to read a couple books a year about this. And do that forever. Or every third book I read is going to be about anti-racism. And then again, show up in community, because there are people that have been doing this work, and we need to be able to learn from them. And we can't always rely on Black people to teach us how to do it, right? Like Black folks are trying to live their lives, they're trying to survive oppression, and they're trying to organize many times their own folks. So we have to be willing to do this work on our own time, to see it as our work, because it is our work as white people.
And speaking more broadly about the current moment we're in, you've been arrested multiple times, I believe, at protests. Can you tell our audience what that experience has been like for you?
Yeah, I recognize when it's happening that it is, my experience is very different oftentimes than the experience of Black friends of mine who were arrested, right? Even the first time I was arrested in New York, getting to see just how I was treated by the police differently, and I think almost seen as like, oh, this guy, he's not that different than me, that I think that I was seen that way, is a part of how these systems sort of replicate themselves. And as a white person, it's important for me to realize that the risk that I take in getting arrested or being on the front lines of a protest is not nearly the same level of risk that Black folks are taking. So it's important to, as white folks, to be upfront about that, to be upfront on the front lines about that, and to really make sure that we are interrupting, we're putting our bodies in between, right? Because we know that at protests where there are heavy presences of Black folks, then more people are going to be arrested very often and injured. So it's important to be upfront there. In the same way, it's important to be filming, to be filming when we see police stopping Black folks, even if it's a traffic stop, to be there filming so that the police know that we are watching, so that folks know, that if something happens, it's on tape. We know that doesn't guarantee justice, but it's an important step. And we actually have to get more proximate to the issues. And I think a lot of times as white folks, most of our experiences with understanding what police do is through watching TV, which is usually a lot of garbage, right? That's not what police work is. But I'll tell you my lived experience, my learnings of filming police officers, even for traffic stops, who often try to intimidate me or tell me that I'm not allowed to film or that it's illegal, or shine the lights of their cars in my eyes, or tell me they'll see me later. These things actually give you a lesson about the culture of policing and what policing was actually designed to do. So we got to be willing to get up, be uncomfortable, ultimately is a huge portion of this work, and to get up front and be up front and center.
And we only have time for one more question here, Matt, but I want to ask you what success looks like for you, and how you're potentially able to find moments of success in your work.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think my old relationship with sort of goal setting, which I think comes from, again, a sort of very male socialized, white supremacist socialized way of goal setting. It was almost like never allow myself to be happy until I've achieved the goal. And again, to recognize that this work is multi-generational, right? Like abolitionists fought against slavery for hundreds of years, right? So there were people who lived, multiple generations of people who lived and died their whole lifetime, who never saw the end in sight. So it's been about reframing what success can mean to me, and to actually understand that I have to prioritize joy in my own life to be able to sustain this, right? And so that means, taking in the success of even like being at an action that where people turn out in great numbers, right? For understanding that, like,
Folks, I think we are having a little bit of an internet connection issue with Matt, but I think we have him back. Matt, I'm so sorry.
Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Oh no, you might be gone again. I think we're almost at the end of our live, so we'll see. We'll give it a couple seconds to see if Matt comes back in, because we'd love to hear a final thought from him. But folks who are watching, I can't thank you enough for joining for this conversation. Please continue to follow Bloomberg Quick Take on all social platforms. Matt is back. I'm so sorry, Matt. What were you saying? Okay, he's not back, folks. I'm so sorry. We're going to wrap up, but thank you so much, Matt, for joining us, and thank you everyone for watching. Again, follow Bloomberg Quick Take wherever you get your news on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram.